Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. I am rigging up a few rods. I've actually got a little tournament that we're going to be fishing this weekend. Hank and I, and maybe Duke, depending on what fishery we're on, but it's our Wednesday night championship. At least that's what we call the championship. There's really no points or anything involved. It's just the guys getting together to fish a longer full day tournament on a weekend day and not a Wednesday. So we don't know where we're fishing offhand for that, but I am just getting a couple of rods rigged up. We find out, I think tonight, what lake it's going to be on. It could be on any of the lakes that we fish on Wednesday nights. So, doesn't really change much in terms of what I'm going to rig up. But I did come down here and just happened to grab some of the rods and looked at them and was like, well, it's going to take a little longer than I thought. This was Duke's rod from when we were fishing bluegills at my parents' cabin up north from what was probably a couple weeks ago at this point. But so I got a little bit extra rigging to do. But having said that, one of the questions I get from you guys quite a bit, anytime I do a on the water video, if I happen to show the knot, like I'm talking while I'm rigging up a knot, I get a lot of questions from you guys regarding the knots that I use, which, let me just preface by saying, I think it's great to know a bunch of different knots. I also think the best thing any angler can do is learn to tie a handful of knots extremely well, meaning you're efficient at it and they are not ever incorrect. And you know what a knot looks like when it wasn't tied correct, because a lot of times that's almost as important. When you tie a knot, if you're really good at tying that knot, you can look at it and be like, that's a good knot. If there's something that's off, maybe you see that one of the strands is in a different position, or you get a little loop, or the shape of the knot's a little different. If you can identify that and you need to retie that knot, that's as important as being able to tie 25 different knots, in my opinion. So I figured I would show you the knots, or at least tell you the knots that I'm doing. I've done videos on pretty much every one of these knots in the past, so if you want to learn how to use them, you can search my channel and find it. I'll link some at the back or at the end of this, so you can click on it as well. But I primarily I use 3 knots. Maybe in a rare instance I'll work in another one. And I will say it's probably more like 4 knots. I am starting to tie more loop knots. I do think that there's some applications where a loop knot does come into play better over some other knots, but that would probably be the 4th knot. So this is how I break it down. If I'm using fluorocarbon line, so the knot that I'm tying with fluorocarbon to my bait, direct fluorocarbon to the bait, that's going to be called a Miller knot. And that's the knot that I think most people haven't heard of that much. I've talked about it. I've done videos in the past. And that's probably the one I'll link at the end just so you guys can familiarize with it. Extremely strong knot. I do think when you're tying a knot that connects to a bait, if you can do a knot that has 2 loops through the hook eye, that's better than a single one. So for years, I always tied just a standard trilene knot. I thought that was a good standard knot. But what I did find was I would break that knot more because it was just one strand or one loop through the eye of the bait. I've since switched to a Miller knot. I know a lot of people like a San Diego jam knot, things like that. I would definitely say, though, you might want to consider tying a knot that has 2 loops, meaning you go through the hook eye twice. And what that does is it really strengthens the connection to the bait. It also limits the movement of that knot on the bait, which can be really good in terms of preventing that knot from breaking. It also means your bait to line isn't going to move quite as freely, which is why I've actually started working in the loop knot on a little bit more occasion. But if I'm tying direct fluorocarbon to my bait, it's a Miller knot. That's the knot that I like the best. I've been using it now for probably 2.5 years and absolutely love it. It's a really easy knot to tie and it does not break. So the second knot that I'll tie is braid direct to the bait. And if I'm tying braid direct to the bait, say it's a heavy flipping rod, something along those lines, I'm going to use a polymer knot, occasionally a double polymer knot if I'm throwing like a 2-ounce weight or an 1.5-ounce weight, really heavy cover. and I want absolutely to make sure that there is no slippage, a double polymer knot. But a single polymer knot works perfect for braid. Really easy knot to use. I would say it's probably the knot that 95% of the pros tie when they're tying braid direct to their baits. It's just the key with braid is finding a knot that has zero slippage. And a polymer knot is really the best one for that, in my opinion. And that's the knot I've been tying, man, at this point, it's probably been 20 years. Like it's ever since I started throwing braid. And then the third knot that I tie, that make up the majority of my 3 knots is a uni to uni knot. So that would be my connecting knot between braid to fluorocarbon. And, with respect to that, that just comes down to that is the knot that I feel most efficient with. I do think that if you learn to tie an FG knot, that's great. And I can tie an FG knot, and I occasionally will tie an FG knot if I'm prepping for, say, my tournament and it's practice. The reality is I get really frustrated with the FG knot because it's not a efficient knot to tie. No matter how you do it, you've got line all over the place, and it takes a lot longer. So for me, I've really just decided at this point that I'm going to master the uni knot, tie it with my eyes closed, tie it when I'm out in 30-mile-an-hour winds, sitting out in 4-foot waves. It's just one of those things that I feel like in a tournament situation, I have to be as efficient as possible. I have great luck with the uni to uni knot, and it's a very easy knot to tie. It's a small knot, and it's really just valuable for that. Now, I will say, if you're an angler that likes to use heavy fluorocarbon with heavy braid and you're looking for a connector knot, at that point, maybe you want to specialize in tying the FG knot because it is a longer profile knot. Now, for me, that's not really relevant because I don't have any instances where I tie a heavy fluorocarbon to a braid. I just really don't like that presentation. I haven't found that it changes the actions of my rod. So if I can get away with not having to tie a heavy fluorocarbon to heavy braid in any circumstance, I don't do it. And if I'm talking about using, say, monofilament as a leader, I will still tie the uni to uni knot. The thing is, in those circumstances, maybe I've got a 2 or a 3-foot max leader. Generally, it's a 2-foot leader if I'm doing it with a topwater bait for some reasons. At that point, it's just the uni to uni knot. It's not even going into the guides of my rod, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But if you're somebody who likes to flip heavy braid to 20-pound fluorocarbon and you want to have 4 or 5 feet of line, at that point, you might need to tie the FG knot just to make it come through your guides efficiently. That's not my style. I don't do that. I'm not worried about that. And again, I tie the Miller knot too with my monofilament direct to my baits. That's what I use for all monofilament, all fluorocarbon. The last knot I'll tie is a loop knot if I'm looking to have a little bit of movement. If you're talking your ball head jigs these days, it is not a bad thing to do. I think with your topwaters, a loop knot's not a terrible thing to do. It just looks, if you want a little bit of free movement or the bait to swing a little bit freer, the loop knot tends to work better than, say, a Miller knot or whatever direct tying knot you're using. But those are the knots that I use, guys. I really think the most important takeaway from this video, make sure you master the knots that you like. Don't worry about going out there and tying 50 different knots. You don't need to know 50 different knots. In fact, that just leads to confusion, and you generally make more mistakes if you're not 100% confident in the knots that you're tying. Now, I will say, if you're having trouble with your knots, so you're fishing and your knots are breaking or your knots are slipping, that's a good opportunity to start evaluating some of these other knots. And then you look at, people that you are confident in. So if you're having trouble connecting your fluorocarbon to your directly to your baits and you're looking for a new knot, I suggest the Miller knot. I think that's an easy, extremely durable, tough knot to tie. But if you're not having issue with that, I would stick with what you're doing. There's no real reason to change at that point if you're not breaking your knots or having your knots pull free on you. That's the biggest takeaway from this. Just be confident in the knots that you're tying. You need 3, maybe 4 knots. That's about all you really need. Don't get too fancy with it. Anyways, I'm going to get back to rigging some of these rods. I'm probably going to have to pull all the line off that spool just to get it to lay back flat. Thanks to Duke and his bluegill conquering. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. Let me know in the comment section. What are some of your favorite knots to tie? Because maybe there's some other viewers out there that are looking for suggestions from you as well. Otherwise, stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow for you.